The silence in the council chamber stretched on as 12 alien species tried to process what they had learned about humanity and what it meant for the future of galactic civilization. Jake stood behind the crystal table with 3 skulls and a peace treaty as evidence of humanity's true capabilities and waited for their response. High Chancellor Vexith was the first to speak, but his voice carried none of its usual diplomatic authority. Instead, he sounded like someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the universe was wrong. Admiral Morrison, you are telling us that War Prime Kethvol surrendered his entire fleet because he was afraid of what humans might do if we stopped restraining ourselves according to Alliance protocols. That is correct, Chancellor, Jake replied. But the story does not end there. Kethvol wanted to meet with me personally after his champion died, and what he told me changes everything we thought we knew about the threats facing Alliance space. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a combination of metal and organic tissue fused together by technology beyond current Alliance understanding. Several representatives made sounds of alarm as they recognized Kethvar Biotechnology. This is a communication device that Kethvol gave me along with the surrender treaty. It contains intelligence about threats that make the Kethvar look like children playing with toy weapons. Admiral Zethka bubbled a question through her translation unit. What kind of threats, Admiral Morrison? The Kethvar were not invading Alliance space because they wanted to conquer us, Jake explained as he set the device on the table next to the skulls. They were running from something worse. Something that exists in the dark spaces between galaxies and feeds on civilized worlds. Jake activated the device, and holographic images began appearing above the crystal table. The images showed creatures that defied description and weapons that could destroy entire star systems. The alien representatives watched in growing horror as they saw glimpses of threats that existed beyond their worst nightmares. Kethvol calls them the Void Hunters, Jake continued. They consume the energy of living worlds and turn the remains into breeding grounds for more of their kind. The Kethvar have been fighting them for over 50 years and losing ground every year. Minister Qualith made a sound like electronic screaming through his voice synthesizer. How many of these creatures exist, Admiral Morrison? Kethvol estimates. Their fleet numbers in the millions with individual ships larger than our biggest space stations. They use weapons that can turn planets into dead rocks in minutes, and they travel through dimensions that normal physics cannot explain. The holographic display changed to show tactical information about Void Hunter capabilities and previous battles against them. Jake watched the alien representatives as they tried to comprehend threats that made their current problems seem insignificant. But there is something else, Jake said as he manipulated the controls of the device. Something that gives us hope for survival against these creatures. The display showed recordings of Void Hunter encounters with different species across the galaxy. The pattern was always the same, with civilized worlds falling quickly to overwhelming force and superior technology. But there were exceptions to this pattern that caught Jake's attention. The Void Hunters have one weakness that Kethvol discovered during 50 years of warfare against them. They cannot adapt to opponents who fight in ways their programming does not anticipate. They are incredibly advanced, but their tactics are based on logical analysis of enemy capabilities and predictable responses. Counselor Thesara resonated a question that sounded like hope mixed with desperation. How does this weakness help us, Admiral Morrison? Because humans do not fight logically, Jake replied. We fight with instincts. The alien representatives stared at Jake in complete confusion as they tried to understand what he meant by talking a warrior to death. Minister Qualith was the first to break the silence with a question that came through his voice synthesizer. As a whisper of electronic wind, "Admiral Morrison, please explain how conversation can be used as a weapon against a trained combat specialist." Jake set the largest skull back on the crystal table and looked around the chamber at the faces of 12 different species who thought they understood warfare and civilization and what it meant to be intelligent life in the galaxy. The third, Death Commando, was named Kethtar the Undefeated, and he had personally killed over 300 enemy warriors in single combat. He was bred from birth to be the perfect fighting machine with enhanced reflexes and strength and training that began before he could walk. But he had one weakness that none of his previous opponents had ever exploited. Jake paused and walked closer to the High Chancellor's platform so his words would carry clearly to every representative in the chamber. He had never encountered anything like a human from Earth. His entire understanding of combat was based on fighting civilized species from peaceful worlds. He expected opponents who followed rules and codes of honor and who fought according to predictable patterns. Admiral Zethka made a bubbling sound that indicated deep concern. "What did you tell this warrior that caused his death, Admiral Morrison?" "I told him about Earth," Jake replied. "I explained what it means to evolve on a death world where everything is trying to kill everything else all the time. I described the kind of creatures that humans had to compete with in order to survive long enough to develop intelligence." Jake began walking around the central table as he continued his explanation. The three skulls watched him with empty eye sockets as he described events that had fundamentally changed how the galaxy's most dangerous warriors viewed humanity. "I told Kethtar about Earth's predators, lions that hunt in coordinated packs and can bring down prey 10 times their size, sharks that have remained unchanged for millions of years because they achieved evolutionary perfection as killing machines, bears that can tear apart armored vehicles with their bare claws." Several of the alien representatives made sounds of disbelief. Their homeworlds had dangerous animals, but nothing approaching the lethality that Jake was describing. But then I explained that humans did not just survive among these predators. We became the apex predator on our world. We hunted the hunters and drove species to extinction, not through superior strength or speed, but through intelligence and cooperation and absolute ruthless determination. Counselor Thisara resonated a question that sounded like crystal chimes in a strong wind. "How did this information affect the Kethvar warrior Admiral Morrison?" "It confused him at first," Jake replied. "He had been taught that civilized species evolved beyond the need for predatory behavior. The idea that humans had retained and refined their hunting instincts while also developing advanced technology was something his worldview could not accommodate." Jake stopped walking and faced the High Chancellor directly. His voice took on the tone of someone describing a pivotal moment in galactic history. So I gave him specific examples. I told him how humans domesticated wolves, which were among Earth's most dangerous pack hunters. We took apex predators and turned them into loyal companions who would die to protect us. I explained that humans call this process making pets out of creatures that could kill us. The chamber remained silent, but Jake could see the growing alarm in the eyes of the alien representatives. They were beginning to understand that humanity represented something unprecedented in their experience of galactic civilization. I described how humans explored every environment on Earth, no matter how hostile. The deepest oceans where pressure would crush any normal creature. The highest mountains where the air is too thin to breathe. Deserts where the heat can kill in minutes, and polar regions where the cold does the same. And I explained that humans did not just survive in these places, but learned to see them as recreational destinations. Minister Qualeth's voice synthesizer produced a sound like a mechanical gasp. What was the Kethvar warrior's response to this information, Admiral Morrison? He asked me if humans had any natural predators left on Earth, Jake replied. So I told him the truth. The only thing on Earth that regularly hunts and kills humans is other humans. We are our own apex predator. Jake picked up the peace treaty from the table and held it so the representatives could see the primitive paper document that had ended a galactic war. That was when Kethtar understood what kind of enemy he was facing. He realized that humans were not just another civilized species playing at warfare according to polite rules. We were something that had never existed in his experience or in Kethvar history. What did he realize, Admiral Morrison? Asked Admiral Zethka. He realized that humans were evolution's answer to the question of what happens when you put intelligence and technology into the body of a creature that evolved to be Earth's ultimate survivor. We are not civilized beings who occasionally resort to violence. We are predators who learn to build spaceships. Jake set the treaty back on the table next to the three skulls and continued his explanation of how psychological warfare had succeeded where military force had failed. I told Kethtar about human military history, how we developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to kill other humans as efficiently as possible. I explained that every major technological advancement in human civilization was quickly adapted for warfare because conflict and competition drove our development. The alien representatives exchanged worried glances and communications in their native languages. Jake could see them beginning to understand that their assumptions about humanity had been dangerously naive. I described World War II, where humans killed over 60 million of their own species in 6 years using weapons that could destroy entire cities. I explained that this was not unusual in human history, but merely the largest example of something that had been happening for thousands of years. Vexith spoke in a voice that carried undertones of fear, despite his attempt to maintain diplomatic composure. How did this warrior react to learning about human warfare, Admiral Morrison? He asked me why humans had joined the Alliance if we were such dangerous creatures, Jake replied. So I told him that humans had decided cooperation was more efficient than conquest for achieving our long-term goals. But that did not mean we had forgotten how to be what we were evolved to be. Jake gestured toward the skulls on the table as evidence of his words. I explained to Kethtar that the same instincts that made humans successful predators on Earth also made us unpredictable opponents in space warfare. We do not follow the codes of honor that limit other species because honor codes are luxury items that evolution does not provide to creatures fighting for survival. What was the final factor that convinced this warrior to surrender? Asked Thaisara. Jake's smile was cold and predatory in a way that made several alien representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. I told him that if the Kethvar continued their war against the Alliance, then humans would stop trying to fit in with civilized galactic society. We would stop following Alliance rules of engagement and start fighting the way we fought on Earth when survival was the only thing that mattered. The chamber fell silent as the representatives contemplated what Jake was telling them about humanity's true nature and capabilities. Kethtar died of a massive heart failure brought on by psychological shock and stress. His body simply could not handle the realization of what humans actually were beneath our civilized exterior. War Prime Kethavol found him in the combat chamber and understood immediately what had happened. Jake picked up the peace treaty one final time and held it toward the High Chancellor. Kethavol signed this surrender document within an hour of finding his champion's body. He understood that the HFY had encountered something beyond their ability to defeat or understand, something that made their greatest warriors die of fear. The questions came like a flood as every representative in the chamber tried to understand how one human had accomplished what their combined fleets could not. Jake stood behind the crystal table with the 3 HFY skulls arranged in front of him and listened to the chaos of alien voices demanding explanations in 12 different languages. High Chancellor Vexith raised one of his 4 arms to call for order, and the chamber gradually fell silent. His compound eyes focused on Jake with an intensity that would have been intimidating if Jake had not spent the last 3 months staring into the faces of creatures far more frightening than any Alliance bureaucrat. Admiral Morrison, you will? Explain to this council how you came to possess these trophies and how you negotiated this peace treaty with the HFY. The security of our entire civilization depends on understanding what has transpired. Jake nodded and began to speak in the calm, steady voice of a military officer giving a mission report. He had practiced this story during the long journey to Concordia Prime, but he had not been sure he would ever get the chance to tell it to the people who needed to hear it most. 3 months ago, I volunteered for a solo reconnaissance mission into HFY space. Intelligence reports suggested their fleet was larger than we had estimated, and Command wanted someone to get close enough to gather accurate numbers and tactical information. Admiral Zethka bubbled a question through her translation unit. Why did you volunteer for such a mission, Admiral Morrison? Our analysts calculated the survival probability at less than 5%. Because I knew I was the only one who could succeed, Jake replied without any trace of arrogance in his voice. The HFY had adapted to fighting Alliance species and their tactics. They knew how we moved our fleets and how we thought about warfare. But they had never encountered a human operating alone in their territory. Jake walked around the table, so he could face more of the representatives as he continued his explanation. The skulls remained on the crystal surface like silent witnesses to events that had changed the course of galactic history. What I found in HFY space was worse than our worst intelligence estimates. Their fleet numbered over 3,000 ships with weapon systems we had never seen before. They had planet-killer missiles and boarding pods that could cut through our best shields like they were made of paper. But more importantly, they had something else that made them nearly impossible to defeat. Counselor Thissaara resonated another musical question. What did they possess that made them so formidable, Admiral Morrison? Absolute confidence in their superiority, Jake answered. The HFY had conquered 17 different species in the past century, and every victory had reinforced their belief that they were the ultimate warriors in the galaxy. They had developed elaborate codes of honor and ritual combat that emphasized individual skill and courage above everything else. Jake paused and looked at each of the alien representatives in turn. He could see the fear in their eyes as they began to understand what he was telling them about their enemies and about themselves. The problem was that every species they had conquered fought according to similar rules. Honor codes and fair combat and respect for fallen enemies. The HFY had learned to counter these approaches and turn them into weaknesses. They expected their enemies to behave in predictable ways, and they were very good at exploiting that predictability. Minister Qual Eth of the gaseous Velnari spoke through a voice synthesizer that made his words sound like wind through hollow tubes. How did you penetrate their territory without being detected, Admiral Morrison? I did not try to avoid detection, Jake replied with a slight smile. I flew straight to their command ship and requested permission to come aboard. I told them I was a human warrior seeking honorable combat with their greatest champions, the Yaos. Chamber erupted in surprised voices as the representatives tried to understand this unexpected revelation. Jake waited for the noise to die down before continuing his explanation. The HFY had heard of humans, but they had never encountered one in person. They were curious about what kind of warriors a Deathworld could produce, so they granted my request. War Prime HFY himself received me in his command chamber and listened to my challenge. "What was your challenge, Admiral Morrison?" asked Vexith. I told him that humans had heard of HFY prowess in battle, and we wanted to test our skills against their death commandos. I proposed single combat between myself and 3 of their best warriors, with the winner determining the outcome of the entire war. Jake picked up one of the skulls from the table and held it so the alien representatives could see the elaborate ridge patterns that marked it as belonging to an elite warrior. HFY was intrigued by this proposal because no species had ever been confident enough to stake everything on individual combat. He saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate HFY superiority in the most dramatic way possible. He agreed to my terms and selected 3 death commandos for the challenge. Admiral Zethka made a sound that her translation unit rendered as confusion. "How did you prepare for combat against opponents who had never been defeated, Admiral Morrison?" "I did not prepare," Jake replied. "That was the key to my strategy. The HFY expected me to study their fighting techniques and develop counter-tactics based on honor codes and ritual combat. Instead, I decided to fight like a human from Earth." Jake set the skull back on the table and continued his explanation. The alien representatives listened with growing amazement as he described battles that defied everything they thought they knew about civilized warfare. The first Death Commando challenged me in the traditional HFY manner. He announced his name and lineage and achievements in battle. He explained the rules of combat and offered me the choice of weapons. Then he waited for me to respond with similar formalities. "And how did you respond?" asked Thesara. "I collapsed part of the ceiling on him while he was making his speech," Jake said matter-of-factly. "The maintenance shaft above the combat arena was not designed to support the weight of a human and some creative use of explosives from my equipment kit. He was crushed instantly." Several of the alien representatives made sounds of shock and disapproval. This kind of behavior violated every code of honorable combat they had ever heard of, and it challenged their fundamental assumptions about how civilized beings should conduct warfare. The second Death Commando was more cautious after seeing what happened to his comrade. He insisted on fighting in a sealed chamber with no environmental hazards. He chose energy weapons at close range, thinking that would neutralize any advantages I might have. Jake picked up the second skull, which was slightly smaller than the first, but showed signs of chemical damage around the bone ridges. I poisoned him with cleaning chemicals from their own ship's maintenance supplies, mixed them into an aerosol, and released it through the ventilation system during our pre-combat inspection period. He died before the formal combat even began. The chamber fell silent as the representatives processed this information. They were beginning to understand that humans approached warfare in ways that were completely foreign to their experience and their values. The third Death Commando was their absolute best warrior. He had survived over 100 single combats and conquered entire worlds through individual challenge. War Prime HFY sent him to face me with orders to restore HFY honor by defeating the human who had dishonored their traditions. Jake held up the largest skull with its elaborate carved symbols and damaged bone structure. "I talked him to death," he said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. The shuttle docked with Concordia Prime with a soft thud that Jake felt through the hull rather than heard. He checked his uniform one last time and picked up his grandfather's leather bag from the seat beside him. The bag felt heavier than usual, and he wondered if that was because of what was inside or because of what he was about to do with those contents. The airlock cycled open, and Jake stepped into the Alliance Station's main corridor. The ceiling stretched high above his head, and the walls curved in graceful arcs that made him feel like he was walking through the inside of some giant creature. Everything was smooth and flowing and designed to make visitors feel peaceful and calm. It was exactly the opposite of human architecture, and it reminded Jake of all the ways his species was different from the others in the Alliance. 2 security guards waited for him at the airlock entrance. They were Zefti with their insect-like bodies and multiple arms that moved in patterns Jake had learned to recognize over his years of service. The universal translator attached to his uniform collar turned their clicking speech into words he could understand. "Admiral Morrison, you are expected in the council chamber. All weapons and recording devices must remain with security during the session." Jake held up his hands to show he carried no weapons and gestured toward the leather bag. "Just personal items and documents related to the meeting." The Zefti guard ran a scanning device over Jake in the bag. The device beeped several times as it detected the organic materials inside, but the guards seemed satisfied that nothing posed a threat to station security. They had no way of understanding what those organic materials represented or why Jake had brought them to this meeting. The walk to the council chamber took 15 minutes through corridors that seemed designed to impress and intimidate visitors. Jake passed displays showing the achievements of Alliance science and art and the peaceful cooperation between species that had lasted for over 200 years. It all looked very impressive and very civilized and very different from anything humans had ever built. The council chamber itself was a marvel of alien engineering. The room was circular with a high domed ceiling that showed a holographic display of the galaxy, with all Alliance territories marked in different colors. 12 raised platforms arranged around the circle held the representatives of the member species and their support staff. In the center was a large table made of some kind of crystal that could display 3-dimensional images of whatever the council wanted to examine. Jake had been in this room before, but never as the focus of everyone's attention. Usually he sat in the human section as part of a larger delegation and listened to debates about trade agreements or territorial disputes. Today he stood alone in the center of the chamber, while 12 different species looked down at him with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile. High Chancellor Vexith of the Zefti Confederation spoke first. His voice came through the translation system as a formal and slightly condescending tone that Jake had learned to associate with Alliance bureaucrats who thought humans were barely civilized savages. "Admiral Morrison, we have called this emergency session to address the continued participation of humanity in our alliance. The recent crisis with the HFY fleet has demonstrated the need for new approaches to galactic security, and we must evaluate whether human methods are compatible with Alliance values." Jake said nothing. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was more powerful than words when dealing with alien politics. Instead, he walked to the central table and set his leather bag down on its crystal surface. The bag looked crude and primitive next to the advanced technology that surrounded it, but Jake knew that appearances could be deceiving. "We are aware of the reports that the HFY fleet has suddenly ceased hostilities and is requesting surrender negotiations," continued Vexith. "What we do not understand is how this situation developed or what role, if any, human forces played in this unexpected development." Jake opened the leather bag slowly and deliberately. The chamber fell silent as he reached inside and removed the first object. It was a skull, but not a human skull. This one was longer and narrower, with ridged bone formations that marked it, as belonging to a HFY warrior. Jake placed it on the crystal table with a soft click that echoed in the silent chamber. Several of the alien representatives made sounds of surprise or disgust as Jake removed the second skull from his bag. This one was larger than the first, with more elaborate ridge patterns that indicated higher rank in HFY society. Jake placed it next to the first skull and reached into his bag again. The third skull was the largest of the three, and its bone. Ridges were carved with symbols that Jake had learned represented the highest levels of HFY military achievement. This skull had belonged to a death commando, and Jake placed it carefully between the other two skulls so that all three faced toward the High Chancellor's platform. The chamber erupted in a chaos of alien voices as the representatives began talking all at once in their native languages. The translation system struggled to keep up with the flood of words and questions and demands for explanation. Jake ignored the noise and reached into his jacket pocket to remove a simple piece of paper that looked primitive and crude compared to the advanced data storage devices used by Alliance species. He placed the paper on the table next to the three skulls and spoke in a voice that cut through the alien chatter like a blade through silk. Peace treaty, signed by War Prime HFY himself. Complete and unconditional surrender of the entire HFY armada effective immediately. The chamber fell silent again, as the representatives stared at the simple paper document that promised to end a war that had threatened to destroy the Alliance. Jake stood behind the table with his hands clasped behind his back and waited for the questions that he knew were coming. Admiral Zethka of the Aquatic Merdan Empire was the first to speak. Her translation unit turned her underwater speech patterns into words that bubbled and flowed like water over stones. How is this possible, Admiral Morrison? The HFY have never surrendered to anyone in their recorded history. They're death commandos, are legendary warriors who have never been defeated in single combat. Jake gestured toward the three skulls on the table. These belong to three HFY death commandos who challenged me to single combat 3 months ago during a reconnaissance mission in their territory. The winner would determine the fate of the war between our species. Counselor Thisara of the crystalline Thekmori resonated a question that the translation system rendered as musical tones. You defeated 3 death commandos in single combat. Admiral Morrison, how is such a thing possible for a human from a primitive world? Jake's smile was cold and sharp, and completely human in a way that made several of the alien representatives shift uncomfortably in their positions. I fought like I was from Earth, Counselor. I fought dirty. The silence that followed was different from the surprised quiet that had greeted his earlier announcement. This silence was heavy with fear and uncertainty as 12 alien species began to understand that they might have misjudged humanity in fundamental ways. Jake stood in the center of their chamber, surrounded by the symbols of his victory, and waited to see how they would respond to the truth about what humans were capable of when they stopped trying to fit in with civilized galactic society. The leather bag sat empty on the crystal table next to 3 skulls and a peace treaty that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. Jake Morrison had walked into this chamber expecting to defend humanity's right to exist in Alliance space. Instead, he was about to teach them why they needed humans more than humans needed them. The red lights flashed across the bridge of the human ship, Terra's Revenge, as Jake Morrison read the message that had just arrived through the quantum communication array. The words on the screen made his jaw tighten and his hands form fists. At his sides, emergency session of the Galactic Council. Immediate attendance required. Final decision on human membership in the Alliance pending. Jake had been expecting this message for weeks now, but seeing it still hit him like a punch to the gut. The other alien species had been talking behind closed doors, and humans were not invited to those conversations. He could guess what they were discussing, and none of it was good news for Earth or humanity. The bridge crew around him worked quietly, at their stations, but Jake could feel their eyes on him when they thought he was not looking. They all knew what this message meant. If the Council voted to remove humanity from the Alliance, then Earth would be alone again. Alone against whatever threats came from the dark spaces between the stars. Lieutenant Amy Carter approached from the communications station with a data pad in her hands. Her face was pale, and she moved with the careful steps of someone trying not to show fear. Admiral Morrison, sir, the message came with coordinates for the meeting location. They want you at Concordia Prime within 48 hours. Jake took the data pad and looked at the numbers. Concordia Prime was the massive space station that orbited the neutral world of Xerion in the center of Alliance space. It was where the most important decisions got made, and where careers were built or destroyed with a single vote. Jake had been there before, but never for something this important. Set course for Xerion, Amy, and tell the engine room, I want maximum speed. We are not going to be late for this meeting. Jake handed the pad back to the young officer and walked toward his ready room. I will be in my quarters, preparing for what comes next. The ready room was small and cramped, like everything else on human ships. The Alliance species built their vessels with high ceilings and wide corridors because they liked space and comfort. Humans built their ships for function and efficiency. Every meter of space had a purpose, and nothing was wasted on decoration or comfort that did not serve the mission. Jake sat at his desk and opened the secure file cabinet that held his most important documents. Inside was a worn leather bag that had belonged to his grandfather, who had served in the old Earth military before humans ever left their home planet. The bag was simple brown leather with brass buckles, and it showed the wear of many years and many missions. He opened the bag carefully and looked at the contents. 3 objects that most people would find disturbing or frightening. 3 pieces of evidence from a mission that officially never happened and that Jake had never reported to Alliance Command. A mission that had taken him deep into enemy space and changed everything he thought he knew about war and peace and what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of alien species. The ship shuddered slightly as the engines reached full power, and Jake felt the familiar sensation of acceleration pressing him back into his chair. They were moving fast now through the void between stars toward a meeting that would decide the future of his species. Part of him wanted to turn the ship around and head back to Earth to warn them of what was coming, but he knew that running away would only make things worse for humanity in the long run. Jake had served in the Alliance military for 12 years, since Earth joined the galactic community. He had seen how the other species looked at humans, and he understood why they were afraid. Earth was what they called a death world, and humans were the products of evolution on a planet that tried to kill everything that lived on it. Most species evolved on worlds where cooperation was easy and conflict was rare. Humans evolved in constant competition with everything around them, including each other. The other species had advanced technology and peaceful societies, but they had never learned to fight the way humans fought. They had rules and codes of honor and ways of doing things that made sense on their safe worlds. Humans had learned different lessons on their dangerous world, and those lessons did not always fit with Alliance ideas about proper behavior. 3 hours into the journey toward Xerion, Jake was called to the bridge by the communications officer. Lieutenant Carter was standing at her station with a confused look on her face and holding a message pad that she was reading and rereading as if the words might change. "Admiral, we are getting reports from multiple sources about the HFY fleet, sir. They are saying something impossible has happened, but the reports all agree on the basic facts." Jake felt his heart rate increase at the mention of the HFY. They were the reason for this emergency council session. The alien war fleet that had been cutting through Alliance space like a knife through paper for the past 6 months. No one had been able to stop them, and entire star systems had fallen to their advance. The council was desperate for any solution, and some of them thought that desperation was the only reason they were still willing to work with humans. "What are the reports saying, Amy?" "Sir, they are saying the HFY fleet has stopped its advance and is requesting negotiations for a complete surrender. All ships have powered down their weapons and are broadcasting peaceful intent on all frequencies. The reports say they want to meet with Alliance representatives to discuss terms." Jake felt the leather bag in his quarters calling to him like a heavy weight in the back of his mind. He knew why the HFY had suddenly decided to surrender, and he knew that the council meeting he was flying toward was about to become much more complicated than anyone expected. "Continue course for Zerion, Amy, and increase speed if possible. I think this council meeting just became much more interesting." The rest of the journey passed in a blur of preparation and worry. Jake spent hours reading reports about the HFY and reviewing everything he knew about Alliance politics. The other species respected strength, but they also feared it, and humans represented both in ways that made them uncomfortable. What Jake was about to tell them would either secure humanity's place in the Alliance forever or get them expelled from galactic society. When Terra's revenge finally arrived at Concordia, Prime, the massive space station, filled the forward view screen like a small artificial moon. The station was beautiful in its own way, with crystalline towers and flowing curves that reflected the light of the nearby star. It looked nothing like human architecture, which was all straight lines and practical angles designed for function over beauty. Jake gathered his uniform and his grandfather's leather bag and prepared to face the most important meeting of his life. In a few hours, he would walk into that council chamber and either save humanity's future or destroy it completely. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on his shoulders as he prepared to leave his ship and face the judgment of 12 alien species who saw humans as dangerous primitives from a world that should never have produced intelligent life. The shuttle bay doors opened, and Jake Morrison walked toward a meeting that would change the course of galactic history.